Reconciliation doesn't live in a single day or week. It's a daily practice of listening, learning, and walking together. In this episode of Catholic Education Matters, host Kimberley Furness sits down with Aboriginal education officers Michael Chisholm and Tanika Thornton to reflect on the meaning of Reconciliation Week, their personal career journeys, and the role of Aboriginal spirituality and culture within Catholic Education Sandhurst. From classrooms to liturgies, from the fire carrier program to the Reconciliation Mass, this conversation explores what it looks like to build a more inclusive, just and culturally safe school system that honours both First Nations identity and Catholic values. In this episode, we explore the role of Aboriginal education officers and why it matters in every school, the importance of embedding First Nations perspectives across the curriculum, how Catholic values and Aboriginal spirituality share deeper connections through land, story and community, the story and impact of the fire carrier program, practical ways teachers can move beyond tokenism to authentic action, and how embracing First Nations identity lifts all students, not just some. Whether you're an educator, student or community member, this episode will deepen your understanding of reconciliation, not just as a concept, but as a shared responsibility grounded in truth, respect and action. Now join us as we explore what truly matters in education. Hello, Michael and Tanika, and welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, Kim.
Good morning, Kim. Good morning, Tanika.
Pleasure to have you both with me. Michael, you're joining us on Yorta country, and Tanika and I are here together on the lands of the Wurrung. Now, we obviously see each other and can catch up every day, but this is such a special opportunity to talk as we approach Reconciliation Week so that we can get to know a little bit more about your career journeys, your roles in Aboriginal education, and the relationship between Catholic values and Aboriginal spirituality here at Catholic Education Sandhurst. Now, I always find it quite interesting how people have found their way into a role. Michael, let's start with you. Could you share a little bit about your career journey into education?
For me, the journey to education probably began through a process of realising that I probably floundered my schooling while I was at high school and through that process. So I figured out that I had to probably go back to do some further education. And once I sort of accepted that reality and took that challenge, I think from that moment onwards, it led me down this pathway to the opportunities that education provides. And certainly being a part of it and having a role and a vocation in education now allows me to stay in that space. And certainly that's where I've found education, through my own hollow or disjointed education experience in school. And that's why I thought, well, education's important. It allows you to have access to opportunity. And hopefully that's what I've been able to accomplish.
And I've also noted that you've worked in all sectors of education, so from higher ed to TAFE and now Catholic Ed. Have you noticed some similarities, differences, or maybe what makes Catholic education so special?
So I think what makes Catholic Ed special is that we have a very rich schooling environment. We're geographically located across a wide area, which means that all of our schools have varying contexts. So when I travel to our schools, what's happening in one area, sometimes a little bit different from what's happening in another area. So that richness of the environment is certainly evident, as well as, I guess, when you're in the schooling system, the students are still, being formed, young, their learning is occurring as they go along the journey. So I really appreciate that aspect of our Catholic education system.
You're absolutely right in saying we have a large geographical footprint. So when we mention Sandhurst Diocese, what we're referring to are large regional centres of Bendigo, Wodonga, Wangaratta, Shepparton and Echuca, as well as all these smaller, vibrant rural communities. And in that area, there are 55 Catholic schools with around 19,000 students, plus our early learning and childcare centres. So it is large. With that comes some beautiful, unique qualities about each of those schools, but also something incredibly special that bonds us all together. Now, Tanika, both of us are very new to Catholic Education Sandhurst. We both started earlier this year. However, we've actually collaborated previous to our work here on an acknowledgement of country artwork for a magazine. Before we get into your career journey, could you perhaps share with us the difference between an acknowledgement of country and a welcome to country?
Yeah, sure. An acknowledgement of country can be done by anyone. So anyone can stand up in a meeting or an event and acknowledge the country that they're on. Whereas a welcome is completed by a traditional owner. So they are welcoming people onto their land. And yeah, that's a special practice that Aboriginal communities would do. You would welcome people onto your country.
Brilliant. And tell me, how did you come to be in education?
Yeah, sure. So my professional career started as a medical scientist. So I worked in a pathology lab here in Bendigo, so servicing the Bendigo Hospital. And in that job, I really liked it because I was putting science into practice, which is one of my passions. And it's all about problem solving, looking at different conditions that patients have and helping to, create that picture of what is going on for them. So from there, I did some work outside, some volunteer work with Wurrung Health, and we did a little bit of youth work. And that's where I started to think more about the longevity in my career. I think working in a lab, whilst it was fun and getting to do a lot of interesting work, I think the day-to-day working in a lab could be quite isolating for me, and I'm quite a sociable person. And I think there's a certain amount of words I need to get out per day. So trying to see the longevity in that was, I had to switch it up. So then it was about deciding, well, where do the qualities that I can bring best suit a career path? So then I decided to study a Master's of Teaching, so science teaching, and it really is a profession where you can make a significant impact for students. It's a really powerful position to be in. It's such a privilege to be able to help students. I feel like teaching the science content would be about 10% of what you do day to day. And I'm sure any educators listening know that that's the truth. And most of your job is about working with kids to help them improve their own outcomes. And that could be academically, but a lot of the time it's their social and emotional well-being. I think education was really important for me because it significantly opened my eyes as a young person. I took my education quite seriously because it was a way to be able to break cycles within my family, and it's about having access. So through education and becoming educated, you have access to opportunities that perhaps weren't available to you.
When you mentioned opportunities and opening doors, it reminds me of that quote, "You can't be what you don't see." Do you recognise yourself as being a role model for those in the classrooms that you visit?
Yeah, I hope that the kids in front of me see who I am and what I am. And I also preach that education is the key to being able to have access. Education and schools aren't a successful place for everybody. But for me as an Aboriginal person, there was a lot. I couldn't see a lot of successful outcomes just with the people in front of me, but my grandmother had put me through high school. So I'm actually a product of Catholic Education Sandhurst. So that was a significant thing for me and a drive for me that, someone else really wants this education for me as well. So you would share parts of your journey with students and say that, you understand that all students come from different backgrounds, and if you try and have a go, there's often some success in whatever pathway that you want to take. So certainly for me as an Aboriginal person, being an educator puts me in a position where I can reach those kids.
Oh, well, you're doing an absolute fabulous job of being a positive role model. I hope you know that. Now, Michael, in terms of the role of an Aboriginal education officer, can you tell me a little bit about that and how you shape classroom learning or support teachers to embed First Nations perspectives across our curriculum?
Yeah, so the ways in which we try and achieve that embedment of First Nations perspectives varies a little, but I think the most effective way is the relationship that we have with our schools. And so we try and support them through that journey and through the development of some resources that we have, and certainly our leadership in this space and our expertise. We provide that with our schools. I think that is beneficial and certainly tries to address that need. The other influence that we have in terms of that is, we're seeing a really significant increase in the concept of inclusive practices and inclusive education. So our governing bodies and all of our strategic sort of education policies are embedding these frameworks and these practices. So alongside of that, if you add the mixture of those frameworks and those strategies with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and our great educators in our schools, I think through that combination, we start to see some really good things happening.
You just mentioned fantastic educators, and we really do have so many of those across our schools. I'm wondering, how do you support teachers who may be a little unsure or nervous about getting it right?
It's a very challenging question there, Kimberley. I guess you need to just step into the space. If you sit outside that space, well, I don't think your growth as a teacher is going to be achieved. And certainly you're not doing your students any justice by not stepping into that space.
Yeah, I agree with that, Michael. What I think is it's not about being an expert, but it's about being an ally. And as a teacher, we're constantly asked to teach outside of our comfort zones, and that happens naturally, and we prepare. And so it's about asking educators to lean into the learning. Like, you need to equip yourself with the knowledge and tools. Because getting it wrong, I can see how people feel nervous around this, but it's paralyzing. It's often unintentional, but that means that if people aren't having a go, these perspectives aren't being included. I think it's about saying, please lean in, have a go, start with listening, connecting, use authentic resources. There's so many out there. If we don't start to put these into our practice, they're not going to be there. I think it's a moral and cultural responsibility that we all have a part of teaching our shared history.
Just to add to what Tanika was saying, there's a real risk too sometimes when we see teachers trying to embed the perspectives to just touch on the surface level and be a little tokenistic in that space. And that doesn't set anyone up for success if you aren't understanding, that relationship between being an ally or an accomplice down through to a tokenistic aspect there. So, there's three things that we ask teachers to reflect critically on. And that's about their own knowledge systems and how they interpret and have a lens of their profession. And then the other thing is, what is their knowledge of their students, particularly when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students? It's really fundamental that teachers have a good relationship with their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. And that's the key to unlocking opportunity for them in the classroom. And certainly through those relationships, we can start to begin to understand one another. And certainly from a cultural and historical perspective in Australia, we can unpack those issues. And the last one is around about the content, where we ask teachers to know what they're teaching. It's valuable to have a good depth of what resources are, authentic and credible in the classroom. And that only comes about by getting in there, having a go, rolling up the sleeves and saying, well, all right, we're teaching about this particular learning area or this topic. Maybe I need to shift my focus now toward, well, what is the Aboriginal perspective here? Is there a perspective? If not, well, we can just move through that space. But if there is an opportunity to do that, then we're encouraging teachers to do that as best they can. And the other thing is just to think about it from a local perspective. You might not have a great history, but certainly we want our schools to be embedding the local Aboriginal history and then building on that and certainly going to that more broader and general history and cultural aspect.
Brilliant. And one of those ways that you can be involved or engaged is through events, celebrations, and cultural activities, just like Reconciliation Week, which this year is held between May 27 and June 3rd. Every year we have a theme. This year's theme is Bridging Now to Next. So starting with you, Tanika, what is the significance of Reconciliation Week for you, both on a personal level and professionally?
I think of Reconciliation Week as a time where culture can be celebrated, and it can be a great week where you see so many people getting involved. I like to think of it as a mirror and a map. It's a time to reflect on where we're at and what we've done as a community and where we sit with our current actions of what we want to do. And the map part is about trying to figure out, well, what's next? What do we need to do? How can we be better? How can we improve? And how can we act with intention? I think Reconciliation Week is about truth telling and healing, and that we have a shared responsibility in this space.
And for yourself, Michael?
Yeah, so just thinking about the theme, I guess it touches on what's happening in a contemporary sense, but it also looks back into the historical aspect of, now we've had many attempts at trying to get things right in this area and move forward for reconciliation. So I guess the theme this year really reflects upon that matter about, all right, we've got a future journey. There's a long road ahead of us, but let's just look back a little and just see aspects of that journey and where we come from. And certainly, as Aboriginal Australians, that journey and that past has been a painful one for us, and certainly want to overcome that and change the disparity that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people find themselves in terms of where they are in society, and particularly in Australia. But so I guess, looking back at ways of which have worked in the past and let those lessons guide us for moving forward.
And Michael, what are you seeing some of our schools in our diocese doing to celebrate Reconciliation Week?
It's a very busy week next week in Sandhurst. It starts off with a few fire commissionings during the week, early part of the week, and a few visits to schools. Some schools are doing reconciliation assemblies and liturgies, and certainly other schools are, pausing for a moment just to think about this whole concept of what reconciliation is and how, as a school community, they can support and help to make that difference.
You just mentioned the Fire Carrier program. As part of my role, I get to spend a little time on social media, and while I'm scrolling, I get to see the wonderful things that our school's doing. And every so often, they're celebrating the Fire Carrier program. So, what is it, and how unique is it to Catholic Education Sandhurst?
Basically, it was an idea that started way back in about 2009, 2010 with the Aboriginal Catholic Ministry of Victoria. So they had a bit of an idea around, how are we teaching culture in schools? How are schools engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and what is the relationship all about? So the idea of that was a way of, providing through an Aboriginal lens and through a Catholic lens an opportunity for us to celebrate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. And so the Fire Carrier program was the idea that we would go into schools and talk about the concepts of reconciliation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and through the Catholic social teachings and Catholic views and beliefs, that there's some similarity or some certainly some symbiosis. And so through that, we came up with that concept around providing reconciliation, and the word FIRE is an acronym, which basically stands for Friends Igniting Reconciliation Through Education. And I'm proud to say that every one of our Sandhurst schools support and implement the Fire Carrier program within their schooling community. So for Sandhurst, it's been running since about 2010, and over that period, we've inducted or commissioned thousands of Sandhurst students, teachers, and Catholic education representatives. So in essence, the Fire Carrier project is to promote respect, fairness, and inclusion for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
There must be also something about it in that, I know my kids come home and tell me about the things they've done at school, and I can see that these young people are going home and they're talking about the Fire Carrier program to their parents, to their siblings, to their grandparents. Like, that must be considered quite an important role of the program.
Yes, certainly. It is a very, very important step in that process.
And I think what we're currently experiencing is schools wanting to move forward in making sure the work with the Fire Carrier program stays active. How are the fire carriers accountable, and how are they responding to the active needs in their community? I think it's one thing to do the commissioning and become a fire carrier, but how are we celebrating this and giving the fire carriers an active role within schools to be able to do some of the work that needs to be done toward reconciliation? Yeah, we've got to keep the fire burning.
Oh, love it. Now, being my first year here at Catholic Education Sandhurst, this week will mark my first reconciliation mass. Tell me, what can I expect?
Lots of celebration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, and an opportunity to come together and gather as a community in a church in a respectful way where, we're celebrating our cultures and our beliefs, and also doing that, in the holiest of fashion through both communion and the Eucharist.
For the reconciliation mass, I like that reconciliation isn't just something that we talk about, it's something that we pray for and celebrate and live. And we get to have a sacred moment where faith and justice meet. So it's a public commitment where we're all together and that we're walking together, and it sends a powerful message to our community about healing and about unity, and that it's central to who we are as a Catholic community.
And that's actually a beautiful segue into my next question. So, how do you see Catholic values and Aboriginal spirituality working together in schools?
I guess for First Nations people, we are deeply spiritual. Our belief system's centered around connections, and certainly through those connections, we have harmony with creation, kinship. We practice law, we practice ceremony. We have a connection that's deeply entrenched in country and place. So that's the essence of Aboriginal, I guess, if you want to call it spirituality or belief. And those connections are so important. And I think looking at it from a Catholic way, in Catholic belief, we espouse to the concept of faith, hope, and love. And when those values of Catholic belief and Aboriginal belief come together, I think it leads to a greater closeness for one another. And then, obviously through that closeness, we have a shared sense of responsibility for things that are important for all of us.
Yeah, and a beautiful example of this in harmony is in Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si, which is about caring for our common home. And so it calls for us to act in a way that is the Aboriginal way, which is treating country as if, it's bigger than you, and to protect and care for it in a way that is about sustaining our future. And we all need to act together to do something.
And Michael, probably a really good time if we could talk about a publication we have that also speaks to the relationship between Aboriginal spirituality and Catholic values.
So Gulpa Nawal Lochpa is derived from the Yorta language. So Gulpa Nawal meaning deep listening, and Lochpa meaning speak. So we wanted to give voice to Aboriginal spirituality in the context of Catholic, celebration and Catholic teaching. So we developed a resource which, speaks to the whole concept of what Aboriginal spirituality is, and provide schools with an opportunity to engage through that resource and answer some of those questions that they may have with trying to find established links with a Catholic way of being, and certainly with the Aboriginal way of being. The content of the booklet, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have contributed to that resource, and so they've shared their own spiritual and religious beliefs in that document. And we put together in the content of the booklet a list of prayers, liturgies, some meditation opportunities, lots of symbolism, lots of art that reflect our culture. And it's a way that a classroom teacher can use that resource to perhaps, from a liturgical sense or from a prayer, they can use that resource in their classroom with their students.
So yes, it is a really beautiful publication, and we'll include that in our show notes. Now, moving on to your work in schools, what kind of change have you seen in our schools over the past few years? And probably for you, Tanika, in your case, your work in schools previous to Catholic Education Sandhurst.
I think going and visiting schools, there is an openness in this area, and people are trying to ask, how do we move from a tokenistic celebrating just during Reconciliation Week or on significant days, and asking the questions of how do we move to a more transformative way that we're celebrating Aboriginal culture. And what we're seeing is educators trying to embed First Nations perspective across the curriculum and asking the questions, how do we do this? What's my first step? How do I go about it? Which is great. I like to see that schools are moving towards making it embedded rather than an add-on on a day.
And yourself, Michael?
Certainly, the teaching of First Nations perspective in the classroom can be quite challenging, but I think for many non-Indigenous teachers, we try and encourage them, to take that journey, to take that first step in the classroom with their students. And I think what is obvious has been the lack of that in the past. So we're now in a situation where our schools are embracing Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander perspective. Our policies and all of our education strategies are trying to adopt the importance of embedding the First Nations perspective through the learning and the teaching. So I guess for teachers, it's just finding ways in which they can do that effectively. And so we've worked alongside our schools as an office. We've provided resources and different frameworks for them to do it as effectively as possible. But certainly it's still a challenge because we do rely on the goodwill of teachers to do this and not do it by chance, but to have a very focused approach to it is what we need in the classroom and in our school communities. So that's just, I guess, a fact that we find is a challenge, but certainly our schools in Sandhurst are doing a fantastic job through the Fire Carrier program, through all of the ways in which we can symbolise Aboriginal culture in our schools, but also, the growth and development of the teachers and through their own journeys of learning and discovery, and then obviously imparting that through to the students.
I think another change is also the mandated changes and additions to the curriculum. So then it has put people in a perspective where, well, we actually have to teach this now, and how do we go about starting that journey? It's even in my background is in teaching VCE chemistry, and elements of that were in all the new science study designs. So we need to do this work and we need to embed because it's now existing across our whole curriculum.
Yeah, it's a really important point to make. Would I be right in saying that our First Nations student enrolments have seen a gradual growth for the last few years as well?
We have witnessed that across all of our schools in Sandhurst. Certainly in the diocese, our numbers have grown quite significantly from even the time when I commenced. That growth is continuing. It's roughly at around 5%, and it changes every year. Some years the increase is up to about 10% in enrolment growth. So there is a very strong urge for our families and our community to choose Catholic education through Sandhurst. And so that's very encouraging. And obviously with that growth, that's why we do need our teachers to have that understanding of the cross-curricular priorities and where First Nations perspectives are embedded in the curriculum, the sustaining those relationships with the community, and certainly making it a safe and culturally inclusive environment for our students and families.
Absolutely. Safety, inclusivity, two very important things there. Now, being a teacher, Tanika, do you have one story that has stuck with you over the years in education?
I think it's hard to pinpoint one specific story, but the privilege of working in education is not lost on me. You're sitting in a position where you get to make an impact in whatever capacity that you are working in education. You get to have the aha moments with kids. You get to help a kid work through some issues that they're having at home. You get to give food to a kid that has forgotten their lunch. Like, there's so many small moments where just that one action can make a change, a significant change in someone's life. You're in a privileged position, your words have impact, what you do in the classroom has impact. So it's about really considering how you front up in education. That's why I think working in this area, specifically Aboriginal education, is of high importance because we need to improve outcomes for our kids.
And Michael, do you have a story to share with us?
I have lots of good little experiences from the role, and certainly it's always good when I hear a story or get some feedback in terms of what difference or impact we have made to a student's life or to students' lives. And in one particular instance, I presented to a school, and I was in there talking about my Aboriginal culture and certainly sharing that with the students in the classroom. And there was a young First Nation student in that classroom, and I found out later through a colleague at the Opening the Doors Foundation that from my conversation in that classroom on that day, he wanted to explore more of his own culture and learn about his own identity. And when I heard that, I felt proud in that moment because of that opportunity that student now has. And certainly, it's always wonderful to hear how we're supporting students become fully flourishing individuals, and certainly to find one's identity is such an important aspect. So yeah, that moment stuck with me and still resonates.
Well, it just goes to show the power of conversation and how important that is. So thank you for sharing that, Michael. Now, to wrap us up, we have come to my favourite part of our podcast series, and that's asking what matters most from this conversation today.
Well, I think I might read from my notes for this one. So I've prepared something I didn't want to just skip over. I think there's so many things that matter most, but I wanted to sort of jot it down what I thought were the key things I would like people to hear. So I wrote that improving outcomes for Aboriginal children isn't just about closing the gap, it's about opening doors and opportunities. It's about creating learning environments where every child feels seen, valued and empowered. For our kids, this means embedding culture, language and identity into the heart of what you're doing as educators, not just an add-on, but as a foundation. When we see our stories reflected in curriculum and that our culture is celebrated, not tolerated, that's when the real learning happens. That's when pride and potential grow side by side. But here's the truth. What lifts Aboriginal students lifts all students. When we teach with cultural humility, when we prioritise relationships, we make space for multiple ways of knowing and being. We create classrooms that are richer, more inclusive, and ultimately more human. We don't just change outcomes, we change the culture of our schools. So please, educators, let go of the fear of not getting it right. Instead, lean into the learning, equip yourself with knowledge and skills and the confidence to walk on this journey with your students. Because this is the kind of education that transforms lives. And this is the kind of future that we want to build together for our schools.
Oh, that's beautiful, Tanika. I'm so glad you took that moment to share what you'd prepared and some really powerful messaging in that. And for yourself, Michael, what matters most?
Well, for me, if I were to close out the conversation, I find great inspiration in a lot of our Aboriginal leaders that I often read and like to hear what they're thinking about, the state of play or the way the world is operating. But today I'm just going to talk a little bit about another fellow who was a white anthropologist named William Stanner. And he talked a little bit about how the cult of forgetfulness and the fact that Aboriginal people have been removed from Australia's history has caused, the dilemma that we find our nation in today. But one of his really famous quotes was, he talked about that many non-Aboriginal Australians think of Aboriginal people with folklore and superstition and, try to tell our narrative. And he said, if only every Australian could get the opportunity to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and get to understand, their life and their meaning, we could turn around the disparity that exists through education and learning about our First Nations Australians within 10 years. So, we've been on this journey since colonisation in Australia, and taking on Stanner's approach, we could shift significantly in such a short space of time. So I just want to leave that out there, and hopefully people will be inspired or intrigued to go and find out a little bit more about our First Nations people and our culture.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for taking the time in the lead up to what is a really big week to share with us your stories of how you've both come to be in education and the important work you do in our schools around Aboriginal education. We do have a shared responsibility, as we've kept hearing today. And I think this year's Reconciliation Week theme is quite fitting in that we learn from the past, we build respect and understanding, and move forward in solidarity. Tanika, I noticed that you mentioned the word impact a couple of times, and we're just so excited to have you as part of the team and look forward to seeing the impact that we know you're going to have through sharing your culture and your knowledge. And I'm not sure if the organisation knows this, but you're also an incredible artist.
Thanks so much.
And thank you, Michael, as well, for everything that you do in leading us through this space. And I look forward to Reconciliation Mass coming up this week.
Thank you, Kim. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Catholic Education Matters. Make sure to follow the show and share it with someone who's passionate about learning, leadership and community. You can also leave a review or connect with us online at Catholic Education Sandhurst. Until next time, stay with us as we explore what truly matters in education.